trip as missioners sort of collides with the experience of migrants. So we stood where they stood, we ate where they ate, we prayed where they prayed, but we came to those moments through very different circumstances. So tonight we're going to take you through the experience from two perspectives. One perspective as us as missioners, so traveling and being in Nogales, and the perspective of the migrants as understood by us through listening and learning that we did on the trip. And we'll go through what it's like encountering the border for the first time, the experience of waiting at the border, both with and without shelter, and the differences between crossing with help and crossing on one's own. And just like last week, we're going to do that through the lens of the Stations of the Cross. And we're going to pick up where we left off from the stations last week.
Okay, so the first station that we're going to look at, we're picking up on station 7 when Jesus falls for the second time. So as you guys read in the, what? You can't hear me? Okay. Okay, so as you guys read earlier in the church when you went through the Stations of the Cross, two lines that really stood out for me that I'm going to relate to our experiences and those of the migrants are, he rose and stumbled ahead slowly. But since I knew this had to be, I walked on silently. So for a lot of the people that we encountered and through a lot of the testimonies that we heard, this is a constant battle. They have so many challenges and so many setbacks that they have to go through. And a lot of the times they get knocked down, and just like this Station of the Cross, they have to get up and then they stumble ahead. And for a lot of people, that starts to wear them down. So just like when you get knocked down, it takes you a little bit longer each time to stand up because there's not as much hope down on this end of the border that we're going to be looking at. And then for the second line, but since I knew this had to be, I walked on silently. So in order for them to get to where they want to be, to get into the United States, to get shelter, they know that this is pretty much their only option if they want to do that and also stay alive and stay well. So they all just need to pick on and keep moving, because otherwise the alternatives are pretty much death out in the desert, which we'll talk about a little later, but those experiences are just heart-wrenching and absolutely terrible. So like the weight of the cross that's crushing into Jesus here, as you guys can see in the picture, and as it's pushing into his raw flesh, this experience of reaching the border and being able to not being able to cross freely, it deepens their pain and it deepens their suffering, and it's just another setback that they have to go to. They're exhausted, they're tired, but they know that the only way they can get to where they need to be, not want to be, because as you guys heard the last time, it's not really a choice for them. The only way they can do that is by picking themselves up and by just continuing day after day to make this journey. A lot of them for 3 to 4 weeks at a time. It's not just a day or two journey.
Okay, so arriving in the borderlands and encountering the border is a distinctly different experience for us, Americans crossing into Mexico, and them, migrants hoping to cross into the US. So Kaylee's going to talk a little bit about what it was like for us.
So when we arrived at the border in Nogales, it took us a little bit of time to actually find the right place for us to be. And you can start to see in some of those pictures, once we did get there, the US side of the border and the Mexican side of the border are completely different places. It's the same land, but the way that the people treat the land is entirely different. So for us going through the border as Americans going into Mexico, it was an open border, so to speak. Our passports were not checked. Our IDs were not checked. No one asked us why we were there. They honestly didn't even look through any of our stuff. From what we heard from one of our guides, Jared, who was taking us on the first part of our journey, they actually want Americans to go into the border. And a lot of the times, if they're checking for anything, they're checking for guns and money. Because a lot of the gun violence that happens in Mexico, which I don't know if this will come as a surprise to you, but happens with guns that were from America. So that's a big deal for them because of our gun laws and how that affects them down there. They're searching for guns and they're searching for drugs or money, stuff that we could potentially be bringing in that may affect their people and their economy. But we didn't face any of that. And for us going into there, we were all shocked because I'm sure a lot of you have traveled outside of the country before, but if you go to an airport, how many times does your ID get checked? How many times do you have to pull out your passport? How many times, if you go through customs, they're saying, why are you here? We faced absolutely none of that. And Jan's going to talk about how different it is for the migrants and their experience at the same border, just different people physically looking.
So for the migrants, it's essentially a closed border. Now, to understand this, I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds in terms of policy, just so you can understand the context for what's happening right now and what was happening when we were there. So US law, and this has been on the books since the 1950s, guarantees people the right to ask for asylum once they are on US soil. And that's regardless of their country of origin. That's regardless of the route taken to get to the border, and it's regardless of the means by which the migrant crossed. So that can be legal or illegal crossings. They have the guaranteed right to ask for asylum. Now, the current situation on the border, as it was when we went down, is that people were being turned away. That right was being violated. So as far back as 2018, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol officers started informing people that were arriving at the border to ask for asylum that the border was closed. At the same time, in contradiction to that, which is a common theme we saw and heard when it comes to policy, some of the ports of entry started letting small amounts of people in. They basically decided on a sort of arbitrary specified number of asylum seekers, and they would let them through. This was a process called metering. And because of this, what happened is that on the Mexican side, different NGOs and even some Mexican government officials and churches and the like started creating these sort of unofficial wait lists, because otherwise it was really difficult to manage the sort of hordes of people that were piling up on the border because they weren't all able to be processed. So what happened is with these wait lists is that different groups, some of the groups which we met with and we'll talk about in a bit, started working with people to get them across the border when it was their turn. So for instance, one of the places we visited, I think had an allotment of maybe 40 people a month, a week. You know, they had sort of a quota of the amount of people they were able to send through. Now, this process of metering was declared illegal in 2021 because it was, again, violating that legal right for someone to ask for asylum. Unfortunately, as you all know, in 2020, the pandemic hit. So when the pandemic hit, the Center for Disease Control implemented a policy called Title 42. It's been in the news a lot. You probably have heard about it. So this basically allowed Border Patrol agents to immediately expel anybody who was apprehended from certain nationalities, including asylum seekers. So again, a violation of that US law. And those people were either expelled to the nearest Mexican city or to their country of origin. This also, Title 42 also, again, blocked people from asking for asylum at the official ports of entry. Now, in mid-2022, the US began processing some exceptions to Title 42. And these were done along the border and particularly for vulnerable individuals. So someone who was pregnant or the elderly and infirm or people suffering from mental health issues. But those exceptions couldn't outpace the wait list, right? People had been sort of piling up all this time, both because of metering and because of Title 42 basically locking down the border. Just recently, in January, they've put in a new process in place to deal with these new exceptions. So there's sort of two new policies that you've probably heard about. One is specifically for people in central and northern Mexico already. And that is basically you have to make an appointment through an app. So we have reached the digital age with the government. So how it works is every morning, a certain number of appointments for port of entry interviews for asylum seekers are made released to the public, and you have to go on that app and you get an appointment for 2 weeks from now. If you've ever tried to get concert tickets, or back in the day, if you tried to get your, COVID vaccine when they first came out, you know how frustrating that is, right? So this is currently the only way to get an opportunity to ask for asylum at the border if you are already in Mexico. The app is only available in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, which means if you speak a different language out of those three, you're kind of out of luck. The app going through this process requires you to have a cell phone service, good internet if you want to try to beat the crowds when you log in first thing in the morning. It requires you to be literate, which some people are not. So, and you have to understand the system. So obviously there's a lot of roadblocks there for people to do this new system so that they can apply for asylum. The other policy that was just put into place is called humanitarian parole. And that is allowing 30,000 people a month from specifically Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And this is for people who are still in their home country. They're able to apply for asylum online, and then they travel to the US through air. So those are the two routes right now that are open for asylum seekers. But basically, because of all those hindrances to the app and having to be back in your home country, the border is still essentially closed. So the port of entry, unlike our experience where we could go back and forth quite freely, the port of entry right now for asylum seekers and migrants is one way. And that way is from the US to Mexico via deportation. And when we crossed this section of the port of entry here, there was actually a area right alongside the path that we walked by that was almost a caged tunnel. And it looked like the type of thing you would put cattle in as you were like bringing cattle in for slaughter. And our guide, who is a Jesuit volunteer, said that it had been understood, they don't know if it had ever been used, that tunnel, that caged tunnel, was built for deportees to walk back to Mexico through. So walking back. Yes. Yes. So again, sort of treating people like cattle.
So before we move on to the next slide, aside from Paula and Ken and Claire and Father James, has anyone else been to the border wall? Okay. Does anyone know what it looks like for sure? I've seen pictures. It's okay. So when we first got to the wall, it was nothing like I had imagined in my head. The pictures up there, if you can see, the wall in the top left picture, there are slots, probably 6 inches wide, not enough for a human being to fit through, but more than enough for you to extend your whole arm through up to your shoulder blade. And to me, this was shocking because in my mind, I had pictured a very solid wall, almost like the Great Wall of China, something that was just high and solid, something that really separated that area. I did not imagine it to be what it was. So from our understanding, in the bottom left-hand corner, if you can see in the picture, all the way in the bottom left, there are these little pieces of wall, sort of like white roadblocks when they close off a street, but metal. And that was the wall that was in place under Obama's administration. And they had basically just left all of that wall out in the desert, thrown into piles, and placed this new wall in its stead. And the picture all the way to the right, you can really see how hilly the landscape is, but they call it the snake because it really is just, thank you. It really just is this fluid, like up and down wall that extends through most of the border. But these pictures don't do it justice. To be able to actually see to the other side is an experience that I don't know if I can adequately put into words, and we're going to talk about it later. But this was on a section of wall where it wasn't really populated, But there were sections of the wall where you could see through to the other side when we were on the Mexico side, and you can see through into the US suburban town. You could see through to people's houses. You could see school buses going through, just people living their daily lives. And for it to be that close, yet that far, it's really hard to put into words. The fact that you can see everything from the migrant's point of view, you can see everything that you want that you can't have. To me, I just pictured it to be this big wall that you can't see through, but you can touch through the other side. You can see through the other side. It's not what I had experienced at all. So to us, it was really this imposing thing that was right in the place. And in a lot of areas, it cuts right through the middle of cities. So there is the same city for us, Nogales. There's the US Nogales, which is in Arizona, and then there's the Mexican side of Nogales. And it really is just a stark contrast between the two, because in a lot of ways, the land is exactly the same. But on one side, even on both sides, the languages, they use English and Spanish in a lot of places because there's a lot of people who are right on the border, speak both languages. But one thing that I also didn't anticipate was that between the section that we had drove through, there are over 20 spaces in the wall where there is no wall. There are these big gaps, some of them smaller than others, but yeah, there's one right there that's being circled. There are some sections of gaps that are 50 to 100 feet long. And when I hear in the news about a wall, I don't think of there being any gaps. And the fact that people can cross from one side to the other at these places, it really puts into question why the wall is there in the first place. If it's not going to be a full wall, to me, it seems like, this is me getting on my own personal opinion in pulpit, but it seems like a waste of money. But what we learned is that these areas where there are no wall, some of it was due to miscalculation, which is very typical of the government. Others are because of the geography. They're called washes, and these places are just places that the wall physically cannot be built because of the water that runs through, because of the rocky geography underneath. But there are many spaces where there are just gaps. And in the 20-mile section that we covered, there was over 20 spaces of gaps, and that continues along the entire border wall. So one other thing that I just want to point out is looking at the US side of the wall, you cannot get close to that wall. The US government has put fences with barbed wires beforehand. I want to say it's probably about 50 feet that you can even get to the wall. But it's very, I used the word imposing before. It is very imposing. There's barbed wire, there's fences. They do not welcome anyone to even go near it. So you physically can't get close. And the Mexican side of the border that Jan is going to talk about is just a very different experience.
So for migrants, the wall has obviously the same physical characteristics, but it's also symbolic and representative of many different things that we as visitors just don't feel. So for some, the wall represents danger. This picture in this painting of the boy here in the upper left is Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez. And for those of you that were part of last year's Lenten book study, you know this story, but for those of you that haven't, I will recount it very quickly. So Jose Antonio was a 16-year-old teenage boy who lived in Nogales, Mexico. And his when he grew up, he wanted to be a member of the Mexican military. In October of 2012, he left his home telling his grandmother that he was going to go meet up with his brother who worked at a local convenience store and help him lock up for the night. His trip to the convenience store took him along a road that runs right up next to the wall. And while he was on his journey, on the other side of the wall, U.S. Border Patrol got a 911 call saying that there were some men throwing over bundles of marijuana onto the U.S. side. Officers responded to the call. They saw two men trying to climb back over into Mexico from the U.S. And the agent who responded claimed to shout at them and then said that he saw stones flying through the air. So he returned to his vehicle to take cover from the stones. And that's when he heard gunshots. And when he looked up, he saw his fellow agent, Lonnie Swartz, firing his .40 caliber pistol into Mexico from the US side. Ballistic reports found that 14 bullets had been emptied, which means he emptied his revolver, reloaded, and continued to shoot. And at the time that this happened, a security guard had been walking behind Jose Antonio, and he saw two youths run past him away from the wall. And then he heard the gunshots and he saw Jose Antonio fall, and he was shot in the back and killed. He's not the only one to be killed by US Border Patrol agents while on Mexican soil. And many of those people have been killed for throwing stones versus bullets. And the agent who shot Jose Antonio never faced any consequences. So you can see why for migrants, the wall represents danger. The wall also represents oppression. So this image of the cutouts of the people on the bottom left here is an art installation called the Parade of Humanity. And this was created by a University of Arizona professor and Mexican artist. And these cutouts of the human forms are painted with different symbolic representations of immigration and different crossing experiences. There's also this painting in the top left, which it's a little small, so it's hard to see, but it's called Innocence at the Border. And that painting shows a migrant on a, I think, donkey, walking behind death. The wall represents oppression. The wall also represents hope, or maybe false hope. Like Kailee said, you can see right into the US side of Nogales, and it is just life going on as normal. And you can imagine what that's like for people waiting to cross. So after a migrant arrives in Nogales and they encounter the wall for the first time, and they're turned away from the border because the border's closed, they have to decide what to do next, right? So many decide to stay and wait it out. They're on an official waiting list, or they're trying to get an appointment on that app. Nogales is essentially a city of people waiting to cross the border. And while they wait, they need to find shelter, which is almost impossible. So we had the opportunity to visit 2 different shelters there, and Kailee will talk about the first one and our experience there as missioners.
So going off of what Jan said, the Nogales side of Mexico, she put in her words, is a city full of people waiting to cross. When we spoke with a lot of these people at the first shelter that I'm going to talk about, all of them that we heard from, and I want to say it was about 15 of them, they all said that none of them wanted to be there. So it really just struck home that this town, Nogales, is full of people who don't really have lives there. They have no roots established. The only reason that they are there is because they are still hoping of crossing the border and still hoping that one day they're going to be safe from whatever sort of oppression they're facing. And the first place that we went to as soon as we crossed the border, it was probably about a 5 to 10 minute walk from the port of entry. It's called Kino, short for Kino Border Initiative. So we were guided directly by Jared, who is our Jesuit volunteer, to Kino. And he made it really easy because we followed him. But for other people, it is not so easy if you don't know where you're going, what you're looking for, or what you need to find. So when people are deported, it seemed like a straight shot to us, but they don't know what they're looking for. They don't know where they're going. They're not familiar with the area. They don't have it so easy. But Kino is one of the 2 shelters in Nogales that pretty much caters to a population full of people who have just been deported. So when we were getting our tour of Kino and we were going through what exactly they do there, Jared had mentioned that they kind of take them through, I believe it was a 5-step process of just learning to accept what has happened to them. So the first few days, they understand that these people are going to be shell-shocked. They give them as much of a private space as they can, but I don't think we have any pictures, but the rooms that they shared were just these big rooms, men and children separated. You can kind of see the bunk bed situation in the middle picture. But there is not much room for privacy at all. But these people are given some space. They're given their time to kind of grieve their deportation into Mexico, and they're given the time to figure out what next. So the main difference between Kino and the other place that we visited, Casa, is that Kino, like I already said, caters to a population of people who are recently deported, but it's also a very short-term shelter. People can stay there for a maximum of 2 to 3 weeks. So this is really just a place for them to kind of get back on their feet and develop a plan for what comes next for them. They have a lot of resources there for people who need legal help or counsel. They have a lot of resources in terms of food and volunteers, and the Good Samaritan group also has volunteers there. And we did, me and Jan and Stephanie, who's not here, and Father James, we went with one of the Good Samaritans on a trip along the border, which is what I was referencing earlier. But while we were there, we helped the Samaritan volunteers serve food. We were able to play games with the children. And another very different experience for us was that you could tell these people had pretty much no hope. A lot of the adults chose to sit alone in silence. There were people crying. The kids were really the only ones who were happy in a sense, just because I think they were so glad to be with other kids and to have access to games, which we brought down to them. But it was very evident that all of these people were worried, they were stressed, and they really just did not know what was going to come next for them.
Now, for the migrants, as Kailee just mentioned, they don't have a guided tour to Kino, right? They got to find their own way there. And there's actually 2 ports of entry in Nogales. We walked through the one that's right up the road, but most migrants are deported through the other port of entry, which is downtown. So they have to find their way to Kino through word of mouth. Some of them don't speak the language, so it's hard asking for directions. The other interesting thing that we learned is that a lot of deportations happen in the middle of the night. When someone is deported, if they have belongings, they're usually given a US issued backpack. It's a camo backpack, and it's very recognizable to the cartels who are waiting for them on the other side. Someone's wearing that backpack, you know that they are desperate, and they're easy prey for the cartels. Another thing that's interesting that we learned from a volunteer at a US side NGO is that sometimes the documents of migrants are taken away from them when they're processed on the US side. And sometimes what they're giving in return, especially if they're being returned to Mexico to wait out their chance for an asylum hearing, they're given a piece of paper that has their name, the name of their sponsor in the United States. And that piece of paper is basically good for travel. It almost like replaces their official documents. The problem with that is that when they are returned to Mexico to wait out their chance at their hearing, some people are picked up by the cartel, and that very important information of who will sponsor them in the US is used to solicit ransom money. So these people are kidnapped, and then their relatives in the US are contacted for money. One of the volunteers told this one story about how there was a time when people were being deported, and the cartel members in their cars were just sort of lined up on the Mexican side of the border, and nuns would come and stand in a barrier between the cartel and the people being deported so that they wouldn't see their faces. The other different thing between us and the migrants in Nogales is that they have to rely on charity for basic necessities. Many asylum seekers spend all of their money to reach the border, and they're not expecting to have to fund their living expenses for months or even years waiting for a chance to cross. So they have nothing left to spend on shelter and on food. And that's why these organizations are so important. Unfortunately, the shelters are overcrowded and not everybody gets a spot. So that brings us to the 8th station, the women of Jerusalem weep. Despite all the pain that Jesus was in, when he saw the women of Jerusalem weeping for him, he went to them and he comforted them. We saw this same selflessness in many of the people we encountered throughout our trip. So migrant parents were putting their children before themselves. Volunteers were putting migrants before their own comfort and safety. And the residents of La Casa de la Misericordia were putting the needs of strangers, us, before their own. And despite their suffering, they were the ones who comforted us. Whoops.
Okay, so the second shelter that we went to was called Casa de la Misericordia. I know you guys watched the video last week, and Paula got to speak about how amazing Sister Lika is, and I spoke about some of my experiences with the kids. But as I already mentioned, Casa caters to a very different population than Kino. Casa caters to people who pretty much are on the waiting list in order to cross over. And it was very evident, the shift in mentality and emotion that they had. More of them were in a community built together, focused on working with each other, and they also just were very hopeful. So our experience when we were visitors there, we were treated like royalty, which made us kind of feel even worse. So they automatically, like Jan said, put all of our needs ahead of theirs. They were sleeping, all of them, women and men separated again, but all of the men, all of the women, they all shared one big room, kind of similar to the space of this, with bunk beds. We only had to share a room with 2 to 3 other people. We were always given the first part of the line to line up for food. They had a party going on when we were there, and they all wanted us to be dancing. They all were very active in making sure that we felt comfortable, that we felt welcome. And we pretty much just wanted to be treated like they were being treated. That was part of the reason why we were there. And their kindness and their selflessness really was amazing, because, as Jan said, when she was relating it to the Stations of the Cross, they really did embody the spirit of Christ. And they were just, I don't have words for the way that they treated us and embraced us like family. But we had private bathrooms that we used. They all shared one big bathroom. Again, I mentioned the rooms. And even on the day we were leaving, we had to get up earlier than they normally do by about 3 hours. And they arranged it so that they all made us a separate breakfast prior to us leaving. And these were all things that were so unnecessary, but that they felt were necessary because they were just so glad that we were there. We were learning their story. And when we spoke with every single person and asked them what we can do, they all said to share our experiences. And that's what we're doing here, which is why it's so important to us. But they didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for physical objects. They really just wanted their stories to be heard and for us to be spreading the word about border policies and what we can do, big or small, to enact change. Lastly, I did speak a little bit about resilience and about the shift in emotion, but the kids, especially for me, touched my heart. And it was so refreshing to see their hope. And Casa, again, is a little bit of a longer term shelter than Kino, but people usually don't stay there more than a few months. During COVID, while things were paused, people were there for a little while longer. But another thing that me and Jan had been speaking about when we had gotten to put this together was we wonder where they are now. And it is really sad in one way, but also I hope that they're here and that they're living a much better life than they were used to.
So to the migrants, for us, we felt hospitality, generosity, we saw the resilience. For the migrants, La Casa is really so much more than we could ever understand. It's security. It might be possibly the first secure place that they have been in since leaving home. There's barbed wire, there are high walls, there's guard dogs. It is a very, very secure place. It means community. There's communal living, separated by gender, as Kailee said, but it brings people together, right? Events like Sister Lika's birthday party brought people together, and they were happy, and you could see the women, got a little bit done up. Like it was a chance to sort of, at least for a very short time, maybe forget their worries. It's also a place where kids can be kids. So parents can let their guard down and let their kids run around and play. Kids are able to go to school to get back a little bit of that normalcy. And it was also a place where they can bring back their dignity. So they have a maker space where people are able to do crafts that get sold to earn money for the next part of their journey. The residents were in the process of building a tortilla shop so that they could start selling tortillas in the local neighborhood. Volunteers would take them out because the families can't really leave because of safety issues, but the volunteers would take them out, sell the tortillas, and again, the families would be able to make some money to carry them through on their journey. And what was also really beautiful was that, from what Sister Lika told us, the residents themselves really take a lot of pride in La Casa, and they worked very hard to make it what it is today. So whether it's the paintings and the murals, or building a traditional outdoor, thank you, Orno, an outdoor oven, so that they can cook as is culturally how they usually do in their culture. Each one of them brought a piece of their self to La Casa to make it what it is today. Now, what's interesting about our journey is that this was really the first place where there was a little bit of overlap between our experience as missioners and their experience as migrants. And we talked a little bit about this, and we thought maybe it's because they spend more time there than in other places. Maybe it's because they feel safe, or maybe they're a little hopeful for the next step. But it's unlike Kino, which there was really just, we were like football fields apart in terms of what they were going through and what we were going through. But here at La Casa, there was some overlap, and it was really beautiful to see, because you could see that the process of healing had maybe begun, even though their journey, there was so much more to go. All right.
So, the ninth station of the cross, Jesus falls for the third time. One of the lines that I kind of came back to that you went over in the church was, "Help me, Lord, to be like your mother Mary, and never take my supporting hand away from those who need it." So that relates a lot to the people that I just spoke about at Casa. They always had a supporting hand out towards us. And in terms of the Station of the Cross, this third fall of Jesus was another test of perseverance, another sense of trusting in God, that there's a plan. Like Jesus, migrants who are unable to find shelter, which is a very different experience than the two shelters we just talked about, not having any shelter, they also have to really draw on their inner strength to continue on this journey and search to continue across the wall. So up above, we have some pictures of the desert at one portion of the wall. I believe this is on the US side. Yeah. So if they don't shelter, there are several possible outcomes that may happen to a migrant. A few things that can happen. There are cartel members who regularly patrol the area, so they could be kidnapped and then either killed by the cartels or held for ransom money. On the Mexican side, in the right upper hand corner, is a picture of a cemetery. A lot of them seek shelter in cemeteries. There is a false sense of safety there. You would think it's a really safe place to be, but that space is not sacred to the cartels. They regularly go through the cemeteries at night looking to find people who are hiding and looking to take them. And then another thing is that they may get discouraged and they may leave Nogales altogether and just try to find their way back to wherever it is they came from, which is another totally heartbreaking journey, because they had come so far, and now because of what Jan said, if they don't have any funds to support them, there's a lot of different reasons for them leaving Nogales. But another one, like we said, is the town full of people waiting. So the shelters are overcrowded. There isn't a lot of room for them. But the fourth option is that they try to cross on their own without any help or assistance. And that can lead to them dying in the desert. The conditions are very rough, very harsh. The weather in the morning is below freezing, and then in the afternoon, well over 100 degrees. They often don't have enough water to get them through. They lose energy really quickly. And when we were riding along the border looking for those who were coming over on their own, our guide was telling us that it's not uncommon for him to find people who have died in their search across the wall to get to safety.
So when a migrant who arrives in Nogales wants to cross, they have the two options, right? They could do the app, or before they could get on a wait list, or they could try to cross on their own. Crossing on their own is an absolute last resort. I think that's a common misconception amongst people where they talk about illegals. It is an absolute last resort. And the number of crossings that have happened outside of official ports of entry has increased in recent years due to basically two factors. One is official U.S. policy. So in the 90s, our government implemented a desert deterrence policy, and it was meant to deter illegal crossings by increasing the border militarization. They did that in cities so that they would push people out to the desert because that was a easier place to cross. And the idea was that as people die in the crossing, word will get back to other migrants and they won't be coming to the border as much. And the militarization didn't just happen actually on the wall and in the border. It happened even in border communities on the US side. So in Avaca, border agents would board school buses every morning to search for migrants. Now, government records, when this policy was put into place, acknowledged that people were going to die, that lives would be lost, but they thought that in the end it would bring the number of illegal crossings down, and it didn't. And the reason for that is because their situations at home are so bad and so desperate that they are still willing to risk crossing the desert. The 10th station, Jesus is stripped of his garments. Now, the stripping of Jesus's garments was dehumanizing and not unlike the experiences of migrants who are stripped of their dignity. Often in choosing to cross on one's own, a migrant's forced to put their lives in the hands of a cartel-controlled coyote, which is like a guide. Stories of theft, kidnapping, exploitation, sexual violence are not uncommon in these situations. And while all of these are dehumanizing, the greatest injustice is that many are left to die in the desert alone. A painful, undignified death. And oftentimes they'll never be identified, they'll never be properly buried, and they'll never be properly mourned by their loved ones.
So for many of us, it was our first visit to the border, I think actually for all of us. And it was the first time that we had walked through this part of the desert. There are, like I mentioned before, are a lot of different dangers, whether it's the cartel. I also don't think I mentioned before, but animals. There's a lot of snakes, coyotes, real coyotes, rather than the guides. And this landscape is very hostile. There's a reason that not much grows there except the cactus plants, because there's no water available most of the time. There's no relief of shade. It's a very, very oppressive environment. So some of the members of our group, which I can't speak to personally, but some of them went on a walk and they were able to, like Ken says in his portion of the video that you watched, they shouted presente. They got to see things that people had left behind. They had gotten to see places where people had actually died. And then we actually got to meet someone who had crossed over the wall. His name was Eduardo. He was coming from Cuba. He had taken a plane from Nicaragua to Mexico, and he had traveled for 21 days on his own up through Mexico to get to the border. And hearing some of his experience was another just punch in the gut. He had chicken pox at the time. that he had contracted on his way. He had seen snakes, he had seen coyotes, he was all by himself. And he had family living in Florida, I believe, that he was waiting to get to. And when we had come across him on our journey, we were the first people he had seen all day. He was already waiting at this gap in the border in the blazing sun for about 5 hours. And if we hadn't gone, who knows like what his fate would have been, but it really put into question that for us. And when we went to, I forget which church it was, but we went to Tucson. There was actually a website online that we could see spaces visually online of all the places that people had died along the way. And there's many more that we don't even know about. So just another really powerful experience to share.
So the hostile desert landscape is really not the only danger facing them once they cross the border. When a person enters Customs and Border Patrol custody, there's still a really big, significant risk to their health and safety, and that's both physical and mental. These Day of the Dead ofrendas, or altars, are memorials for the 7 children who have died.
So if you saw the video last time, we kind of had close-ups of these ofrendas, but these were all in memory of 7 young children who had all passed away in custody of Border Patrol. And it is really, really difficult to even talk about, but there was even in more recently than some of these other children, but there's sets of 3 sisters and cousins who were part of the people who had been found in the back of a truck. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but there were children there who were included. But a lot of them just died due to lack of basic medical care and lack of caring. A lot of them died from very preventable respiratory illnesses. And if they had just been given the proper treatment, care, attention that they needed, they very well could, these deaths could have been prevented. And these children, I mean, all of them are pretty innocent and had to go through things that were none of their faults, but especially just seeing how young some of these children were and how their lives were ripped away from them is really hard to talk about.
Yeah.
To repeat it? Yeah, repeat it now. Okay, some of these children were traveling with other people, either groups of friends and their parents were waiting for them in the United States. So these children died basically alone without their mother and father in the care of the United States.
So with that, we would like to have a brief moment of silence, and then we'll open it up to questions. Thank you. Any questions?
Just would you speak into this?
This little village, La Casa, means the house or the home or something. Was that a Mexican village that was there already that took in the migrants, or was it created?
So it wasn't a village. It was just sort of a compound. There were about 4 buildings on it. And do you remember what it was before?
I think it was a shelter, but I believe that it had been used by the nuns. Sister Lika, she was one of the nuns, and they would offer spaces for children in the community to come after school, get help with homework and different things.
And it was a feeding place too.
And a feeding place. Yeah, a feeding place for people who needed to have supplementation. But she really turned it into more of a compound, more than an open shelter. And was there a second part of your question? Okay.
Who helps to fund these shelters, especially La Casa?
It's really all word of mouth. All the word. I mean, migrants hear it amongst themselves. Sometimes if someone runs into someone in the street, they might direct them there. It's fully word of mouth.
I mean, but I think the question who funds, where do the funds come from to support?
Part of it is self-sufficient. As Jan mentioned, they have a craft making center and they sell bordados, which are these little cloths that can be used for holding tortillas, a few different things. So part of it is self-funded. They use that money for the community. There's also an organization called Cruzando Fronteras, which means crossing borders, and they directly work to provide funds. Is there any other? Yeah, just private donors. I know that we also made a donation, but from what Jan was saying with the word of mouth, people, other churches, other people have gone and visited there and have made donations just as we did.
In addition to that, I think they also had a garden.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Real quick, what's
The consortium, Episcopal Diocese, I think the Lutheran Church and the United Church of Christ.
Yeah.
They help fund.
The La Casa de la Misericordia was part of Cruzando Fronteras. We wore T-shirts. Did you mention that when I was in?
yeah.
And funding comes from the Lutheran Church, the Episcopal Church, and the United Church of Christ, I think, UCC.
What's interesting too is before the implementation of this new app process, organizations like La Casa and Kino were doing all the paperwork and vetting that normally would be done at ports of entries by the U.S. government. So this is a process called border externalization. They were basically pushing off that work to the NGOs. So they were sort of doing the work of the government, zero funding from the U.S. government. Any other questions?
Yes.
What's next? After we stop talking about this next week?
That is next week. No,
Never mind.
That's great. Come
That
back next
will be
week.
Paula's and Ken's job. We will also be offering a lot of resources next week.
Just one piece of information. The app that you're talking about and that new policy by this current administration, it's a temporary one. There's a period for public comment that ends on the 27th, I believe, of March, 27th or the 29th. I may have the date wrong. So everybody, if you can, write in and tell the administration, bad idea. Look at what you're asking these poor migrants to have the apps, to have their cell phones to start with, to go through all of these, things. And in the process, you're depriving them of the basic right to asylum, which is both United States and international law. So it's international. So please, it's something that one of the things we can do, perhaps answering Rob's question to some extent, write in to your senators and other members of Congress saying this is a bad idea. We cannot keep this as a policy.
Thank you, Heather. Okay. I think we have to wrap it up. Claire, do you want to send us off?
So Heather said she will send us the information, and we also have some additional resources that we'll try to make available next week. Are there other questions before we close? I would like to thank you both for an amazing presentation, just an amazing presentation. And as we go to close, I would like to close us with a prayer. It's written by, in the words of a woman named Sarah Quezada. This evening, we have learned about waiting. How often for us have we found ourselves frustrated by long grocery lines or traffic that prevents us from getting home after work? Waiting for our migrating friends is unlike any waiting we have ever experienced. So, in the words of Sarah Quezada, we pray. Most gracious and merciful God, for those families waiting for months at the border, we offer our prayers. Cover them in your grace and protection as they live in close-quartered migrant shelters, sleep in unplanned tent communities, or cook around communal outdoor fires. Many have waited their turn, clutching papers with court dates scheduled months away while existing in difficult conditions. You have accompanied them through the dangers that chased them from their home countries, the ones they encountered on the journey and the ones near the camps. You, O Lord, promise to hear the needy, and you do not despise your imprisoned people. Now, please, Lord, surround them with your love and supernatural covering as they fear an outbreak in the crowded communities where they wait still. Give wisdom and protection to the humanitarian volunteers and the Border Patrol agents who interact daily with the waiting families. We pray too for those in detention centers across the country, still hearts that are anxious about the dangers they face quarantined in tight conditions. Comfort them as visitors are no longer allowed and they feel cut off from loved ones. May you reveal your presence in unexpected ways to those hidden from view, as you have done so many times before. As judges, weigh whether or not to release those who have not committed crimes. Give them wisdom in exploring justice and mercy in this unprecedented time. Help us to remember those in prison as if you were there yourself. Remember also those being mistreated as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. God, may we learn from our brothers and sisters what it means to wait in hard circumstances. We lean on your word. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Amen. Thank you so much.